The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the dimly lit locker room at the Naval Training Facility in San Diego. Commander. Sarah Mitchell stood before her locker, methodically removing her uniform after another grueling day of tactical operations training. Her muscles ached from the 16-hour session. But she had grown accustomed to the physical demands over her 20 years of service. At 42 years old, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Though few people in this particular facility knew exactly who she was, Sarah had arrived at this base 3 weeks earlier on a special assignment. Her mission was to evaluate the training protocols for new recruits and assess whether the standards had slipped in recent years. The Navy wanted an experienced operator to go undercover, someone who could blend in and observe without the usual formality that came with rank. Sarah had volunteered immediately. After 2 decades of classified missions across 4 continents, playing the role of a low-ranking transfer seemed almost relaxing. She had kept her background carefully hidden. The identification she carried listed her as Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Mitchell, a supply specialist being rotated through different facilities for cross-training. Nobody questioned it. Nobody looked twice at the quiet woman in her 40s who kept to herself and did her work without complaint. That was exactly how Sarah wanted it. The locker room was nearly empty at this hour. Most personnel had already showered and left for the evening. Sarah preferred it this way. She enjoyed the solitude after spending her days surrounded by hundreds of sailors and officers. The peace gave her time to think, to process what she had observed, and to prepare her reports for the admirals who had sent her. As she unlocked her locker and began to change, Sarah heard voices echoing from the corridor outside, male voices, loud and aggressive. She paid them little attention at first. Military facilities were always filled with young service members blowing off steam, their voices carrying through the concrete hallways. But as the voices grew closer, something in their tone made Sarah pause. The door to the women's locker room burst open with a bang that echoed off the tile walls. 3 men in Navy fatigues stumbled inside, their movements uncoordinated and their speech slurred. Sarah could smell the alcohol from across the room. They were young, probably in their early 20s, with the cocky swagger of sailors who had just finished basic training and thought they owned the world. Sarah turned slowly to face them, her expression neutral. She had encountered this type before. Young, drunk, and stupid. A dangerous combination, but usually manageable with the right approach. She kept her voice calm and level. "This is the women's locker room. You need to leave." The tallest of the 3, a muscular guy with a shaved head and sergeant stripes on his sleeve, laughed. His eyes were bloodshot, and he swayed slightly as he pointed at Sarah. "Look at this old lady trying to give us orders," he slurred, his companion snickering behind him. "You know what? We don't take orders from supply clerks." Sarah felt the familiar coldness settle over her, the combat mindset she had developed over hundreds of operations. She assessed the situation with the detached efficiency of a professional. 3 men, all intoxicated, all physically fit but impaired. The nearest exit was behind them. Her locker was open, but the only potential weapons were a combination lock and a metal water bottle. The room had security cameras, which meant this encounter was being recorded. "I'm asking you one more time," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "Leave now, and we'll forget this happened." The sergeant took a step closer, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Or what? You gonna report us?" "Nobody cares what some middle-aged paper pusher thinks." His friends moved to flank him, forming a semicircle that cut off Sarah's path to the door. The one on the left, shorter but stocky, with a neck like a tree trunk, cracked his knuckles. The third man, thin but wiry with darting eyes, just grinned. "Maybe we should teach her some respect," the stocky one suggested. "Show her what happens when she doesn't know her place." Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to de-escalate further, but these men were too drunk and too committed to their course of action. She could try to fight her way out, but that would blow her cover immediately. A supply clerk shouldn't have advanced combat training. Or she could wait and see if they would actually cross the line, giving her legal justification for self-defense. The decision was made for her when the sergeant lunged forward, his hands reaching for her throat. Sarah's training kicked in instantly, but she forced herself to hold back, to respond like a normal person would rather than like the lethal operative she actually was. She stumbled backward, her hands coming up to protect herself, letting him get closer than she normally would. His fingers closed around her neck, squeezing hard. The other two men moved in quickly, grabbing her arms and trying to force her down. Sarah gasped, the pressure on her throat genuine now, and she knew she had to make a choice. Maintain her cover and risk serious injury, or reveal herself and end this threat immediately. The sergeant's face was inches from hers now, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Not so tough now, are you?" he snarled. "Maybe after we're done here, you'll learn to show some respect to real sailors." Sarah's vision began to narrow at the edges as the pressure on her throat increased. The other two had forced her to her knees, their grip on her arms painful and bruising. This had gone far enough. Cover mission or not, she wasn't going to let three drunk idiots choke her unconscious. But before Sarah could make her move, the locker room door slammed open again. A woman's voice cut through the room like a whip crack. "What the hell is going on in here?" The pressure on Sarah's throat eased slightly as the sergeant glanced toward the door. Sarah used the momentary distraction to break his grip and twist away, but the other two men still held her arms. She could see the newcomer now, a young lieutenant with shock and horror written across her face. "Let her go. Now," the lieutenant shouted, her hand moving to the radio on her belt. The sergeant released Sarah completely and stepped back, his hands raised. "We were just messing around," he said, but the fear in his eyes told a different story. The other two men let go of Sarah's arms and backed away. Sarah stood up slowly, rubbing her throat where the sergeant's fingers had left red marks. She looked at the lieutenant, then at the three men, then back to the lieutenant. She could see the officer processing what she had walked in on, the gears turning as she decided what to do next. "Lieutenant," Sarah said quietly, her voice rough from the choking. "These men need to be placed under arrest immediately." The sergeant laughed nervously. "Come on, we were just having a little fun. No harm done, right?" Sarah's eyes locked onto his, and for just a moment, she let him see the predator beneath the mild-mannered cover identity. The sergeant's smile faded instantly, and he took an involuntary step backward. The lieutenant was already speaking into her radio, calling for military police and medical assistance. Sarah waved off the mention of medical help. "I'm fine," she insisted. "But I want these men detained and charged." As they waited for the MPs to arrive, Sarah stood by her locker, her mind already working through the implications. Her cover was likely blown now. There would be an investigation, witness statements, and reports. The admirals would need to decide whether to pull her from the facility or to continue the mission under a new identity. But more importantly, there would be questions about why three drunk sailors thought they could assault a woman in a military locker room without consequences. The MPs arrived within minutes, 4 of them in tactical gear with stern expressions. They handcuffed the 3 men and began to lead them away. The sergeant looked back at Sarah as they walked him out, his face a mixture of confusion and growing fear as the reality of his situation sank in. "You're going to regret this," he called back to her. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah almost laughed. She knew exactly who she was messing with. 3 punk kids who had made the biggest mistake of their military careers. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was who they had tried to mess with. The lieutenant approached Sarah cautiously.
"Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Jennifer Harris."
"I need to get your statement about what happened here. Are you sure you don't need medical attention?" Sarah touched her throat again, feeling the tender skin where bruises were already forming. "I'll be fine," she said. "But yes, I'll give you my statement." As Sarah recounted the events, keeping her language simple and her description factual, she noticed Lieutenant Harris taking careful notes. The young officer's hands shook slightly as she wrote, anger evident in the tight set of her jaw. "This is unacceptable," Harris muttered as she finished writing. "Those men should be court-martialed for this." Sarah nodded. "They should be. But I suspect there's more going on here than just 3 drunk idiots making a bad decision." Harris looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The way they came in here, so confident they wouldn't face consequences. The things they said about knowing their place. This isn't the first time they've done something like this. Maybe not this extreme, but they've been getting away with bad behavior for a while. The lieutenant's expression darkened. You might be right. There have been complaints about harassment from some of the female sailors, but nothing concrete enough to act on. The command has been trying to address it, but without evidence or witnesses willing to come forward, their hands are tied, Sarah finished. I understand. Well, now you have evidence? And a witness who's not afraid to testify. Lieutenant Harris managed a small smile. Thank you for being willing to stand up. A lot of people would want to just forget it happened and move on. Sarah returned the smile grimly. I'm not most people. Over the next hour, more officers arrived. Sarah gave her statement 3 more times to different investigators, each one more senior than the last. By the time a captain arrived to take her final statement, Sarah knew her cover was hanging by a thread. The captain, a stern woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair, studied Sarah with an intensity that suggested she saw more than just a supply clerk. Petty Officer Mitchell, the captain said slowly, reading from Sarah's file on a tablet. Your record shows you've been in the Navy for 6 years, transferred from a supply depot in Norfolk. Is that correct? Sarah maintained her composure. Yes, ma'am. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. And yet you remained remarkably calm during this assault. Most people would have been terrified, traumatized. You seem almost professional about it. Sarah chose her words carefully. I've been in the military long enough to know how to handle difficult situations, ma'am. And I'm angry enough that I'm not going to let fear stop me from seeing this through. The captain nodded slowly, but Sarah could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. Very well. You're dismissed for now, but you'll need to remain available for follow-up questions. The investigators may need to speak with you again, as Sarah finally left the locker room nearly 3 hours after the assault began. She found Lieutenant Harris waiting outside in the corridor. I wanted to make sure you got back to your quarters, okay? Harris said. Sarah appreciated the gesture, even though she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. Thank you, Lieutenant. That's kind of you. They walked through the quiet facility together, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Harris seemed to be working up the courage to say something, and finally, as they reached the enlisted quarters, she spoke. Petty Officer Mitchell, can I ask you something? Of course. Those men. They were bigger than you, stronger, and there were 3 of them. But you didn't seem afraid? Even when they had you by the throat, you seemed like you were in control somehow. How? Sarah paused, considering how much to reveal. Lieutenant, I've learned over the years that fear is just another piece of information. It tells you there's danger, but it doesn't have to control you. Those men were drunk and stupid. I knew that if I kept my head, I would come out of it okay. Harris nodded thoughtfully. I hope I can be that composed if I ever face a situation like that. You already showed courage by intervening when you did, Sarah pointed out. A lot of officers would have called for backup first. You went straight in? The lieutenant smiled at the compliment. I guess I didn't think about it. I just knew I had to stop what was happening. They said their goodnights, and Sarah entered her small quarters. The room was Spartan, containing only a bed, a desk, and a small closet. Sarah locked the door behind her and sat down on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to relax. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline from the encounter finally catching up with her. Not from fear, but from the effort of restraining herself. Every instinct had screamed at her to neutralize those threats the moment they touched her. 20 years of training had been compressed into that single moment of decision, and it had taken every ounce of discipline not to reveal herself. Sarah pulled out her encrypted phone and composed a message to her handlers. She kept it brief and factual, explaining the situation and waiting for instructions. The response came back within minutes. Continue the mission. Maintain cover. The assault investigation would proceed through normal channels. Sarah was to cooperate fully, but reveal nothing about her true identity unless absolutely necessary. The morning sun streamed through the small window of Sarah's quarters, waking her earlier than usual. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening. The bruises on her neck had darkened overnight, visible reminders of how close things had come to spiraling completely out of control. She touched them gently, wincing at the tenderness. Then got up and prepared for another day. When Sarah arrived at the mess hall for breakfast, she immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. Conversations stopped as she walked past. Sailors stared, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with something that looked like hostility. Word had spread fast about the incident in the locker room. In a facility with over 2,000 personnel, gossip traveled at the speed of light. Sarah collected her breakfast tray and found a quiet corner to eat alone. She had barely taken her first bite when Lieutenant Harris approached, her expression troubled. "Mind if I join you?" Harris asked. Sarah gestured to the empty seat. "Please." Lieutenant sat down and leaned in, keeping her voice low. "I wanted to give you a heads up. The 3 men from last night have been formally charged with assault and conduct unbecoming. They're in the brig awaiting their preliminary hearing. But their friends are spreading a different version of the story." Sarah wasn't surprised. "Let me guess. They're saying I provoked them somehow, or that it was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion?" "Exactly. They're claiming you came on to the sergeant first, and when he rejected you, you made up the assault story. It's ridiculous, of course. We have your injuries documented, and my testimony about what I saw, but they're still managing to get some people to believe them." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, processing this information. "Have there been any threats against me directly?" Harris hesitated. "Nothing overt. But I've heard some of the guys in their unit talking about how you're trying to ruin the careers of 3 good sailors. They're calling you names I won't repeat. I just thought you should know to be careful." "Appreciate the warning," Sarah said. She genuinely did, though she wasn't particularly concerned. She had faced down enemy combatants, terrorists, and hostile forces in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, a few angry sailors spreading. Rumors didn't rank high on her threat assessment. The rest of breakfast passed quietly. Sarah finished her meal and headed to her assigned duty station in the supply department. Her cover job involved managing inventory requests and coordinating shipments. Tedious work that required attention to detail, but little actual challenge. It gave her plenty of time to observe the base operations and gather information for her real assignment. Her supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Ramon Garcia, looked up as she entered the office. Garcia was a career supply specialist in his late 50s, counting down the months until retirement. He was competent but unambitious, content to maintain the status quo until he could collect his pension. "Mitchell," he said, his tone neutral. "Heard about what happened last night? You doing okay?" "I'm fine, Chief. Ready to work." Garcia nodded approvingly. "Good, because we've got a backlog of requisition forms that need processing. The quartermaster is breathing down my neck about delayed shipments. Think you can help clear it out?" Sarah spent the next several hours working through paperwork, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she processed requests and tracked inventory. It was mind-numbing work. She used the time to think about what she had observed over the past 3 weeks. The training facility had serious problems beyond the obvious incident from the night before. She had documented evidence of corner cutting and safety protocols. Instructors who were more interested in appearing tough than actually teaching proper techniques. And a pervasive culture that tolerated aggressive behavior as long as it didn't cross certain lines. The assault in the locker room wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper institutional failure. Around midday, Sarah was summoned to the administrative building. A Naval Criminal Investigative Service agent wanted to interview her as part of the formal investigation. Sarah gathered her things and made the walk across the base, aware of the eyes following her every move. The NCIS agent was a woman in her 30s, named Special Agent Rebecca Torres. She had sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah immediately respected. Torres conducted the interview in a small conference room, recording everything for the official record. "Petty Officer Mitchell, I want you to walk me through the entire incident again, from the beginning," Torres said. "Take your time and include every detail you can remember." Sarah did exactly that, describing the evening with precision. She explained how the men entered the locker room, what they said, how they moved, the smell of alcohol, the physical assault, and Lieutenant Harris's intervention. Torres took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions. You remained very calm during the assault, Torres observed. That's unusual. Most victims describe feeling terrified, disoriented. You seem to have maintained clear awareness of everything happening around you. She was actually one of the most decorated and respected operators in the entire Navy. But in her current role, she was seen as a low-ranking rabble-rouser. That night, Sarah found a message slipped under her door. It was handwritten in block letters. You should have kept your mouth shut. Now you're going to pay. Sarah photographed the threatening note and added it to her growing collection of evidence. She sent copies to Special Agent Torres and her handlers, then secured her quarters as best she could. Someone was escalating, and she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. She checked the small window to ensure it was locked, wedged a chair under the door handle, and kept her phone within arm's reach all night. Sleep came in brief intervals. Her combat-trained senses alert to every sound in the corridor outside. The next morning brought unexpected news. The sailor who had collapsed during training, a 19-year-old kid named Petty Officer 3rd Class David Chen, had suffered severe heat stroke and was in critical condition at the base hospital. An investigation had been launched into Lieutenant Commander Briggs's training methods, and Sarah had been called to give a statement as the primary witness. Before that meeting, however, Sarah had another appointment. Captain Elizabeth Monroe, the base commander, had summoned her to her office. Sarah had avoided the captain's attention during her undercover assignment, preferring to remain below the radar. Now she was walking straight into the lion's den. Unsure whether her cover would hold Captain, Monroe's office was spacious and decorated with commendations from a distinguished 30-year career. The captain herself was a formidable woman in her mid-50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her reputation preceded her as a fair but demanding officer who didn't tolerate nonsense from anyone, regardless of rank. "Petty Officer Mitchell," Monroe said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down." Sarah took the offered seat, maintaining a respectful but confident posture. She had briefed admirals and generals during her career. A base commander shouldn't intimidate her, but she had to remember to act like a regular enlisted sailor would. Monroe studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You've certainly made an impression during your short time here. Assaulted in a locker room. Intimidated by other sailors. Vandalized. Threatened. And now you've potentially saved a young man's life, while simultaneously creating a huge headache for my training department. That's quite a resume for someone who's only been here a month." Sarah wasn't sure if she was being praised or criticized. "I've just been doing what I thought was right, ma'am." "I've been reviewing your service record," Monroe continued, opening a file on her desk. 6 years in supply, transferred from Norfolk. Relatively unremarkable career up until now. No commendations, no disciplinary actions, just steady, competent work. And yet in the past 24 hours, multiple people have told me you handled an assault with unusual composure, intervened in a training exercise with the confidence of a senior medic, and stood up to a lieutenant commander without batting an eye. Does that seem consistent with your record to you?" Sarah felt the walls closing in. Monroe was too sharp, asking the exact questions that could unravel her cover. "Ma'am, I just reacted to the situations as they happened. I took some first aid courses, and I've always believed in standing up for what's right, regardless of rank." Monroe leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I've been in the Navy for 30 years, Mitchell. I've learned to trust my instincts about people. And my instincts tell me there's more to you than your file indicates. But I'm not going to press you on that right now. What I am going to do is ask you a direct question, and I expect an honest answer. Do you feel safe on this base?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "I'm taking precautions, ma'am. I'm aware of the threats against me. It's not what I asked. I asked if you feel safe." Sarah met the captain's eyes. "Honestly, no, ma'am. I don't. There's a culture problem here that goes beyond a few bad individuals. People feel protected when they behave badly, and those who speak up face retaliation. Until that changes, nobody is really safe." Monroe nodded slowly. "I suspected as much. I've been commander here for 8 months, and I've been trying to address these issues through official channels. But it's like fighting shadows. By the time I hear about an incident, it's already been covered up, or the witnesses have been intimidated into silence. You're the first person who's been willing to stand firm despite the pressure. With respect, ma'am, I shouldn't have to be. The system should protect people who report wrongdoing, not punish them.
You're absolutely right.
And I intend to fix that, starting now. I'm assigning you a protective detail. 2 Masters at Arms will escort you around the base and guard your quarters at night. I'm also expediting the investigation into your assault and the subsequent intimidation. Anyone who threatens you or attempts to influence your testimony will face immediate disciplinary action. Sarah wanted to protest that she didn't need protection, that she was probably more capable than any guards they could assign her, but that wasn't something a supply clerk would say. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get worse before it gets better. When we shine a light on corruption, the cockroaches don't just scatter. Sometimes they fight back. You need to be prepared for that. As Sarah left the captain's office, she found 2 Masters at Arms waiting for her in the corridor. Mawan James Wilson was a solid man in his 40s with a shaved head and alert eyes. Ma-Tu Patricia Chen was younger, perhaps 30, with a lean build and the confident bearing of someone who knew how to handle herself. Petty Officer Mitchell Wilson said, "We've been assigned as your security detail. We'll be accompanying you throughout the day and maintaining watch outside your quarters at night." Sarah suppressed a sigh. Having guards would make her mission more complicated, limiting her ability to move freely and observe without being observed. But she understood the captain's reasoning. "I appreciate your help, but I don't want to be a burden." Chen smiled. "It's not a burden. It's our job. Besides, after hearing what you've been through, we volunteered for this assignment." The 3 of them proceeded to Sarah's meeting with the investigator looking into Lieutenant Commander Briggs's training methods. Sarah provided a detailed account of what she had witnessed. From the excessive physical demands placed on recruits to Briggs's refusal to provide medical attention when Chen collapsed, the investigator, a commander from the Judge Advocate General's office, listened carefully and took extensive notes. "Your quick action probably saved that young man's life," the commander said. "Where did you learn first aid?" "I've taken several courses over the years," Sarah replied, sticking to her cover story. "I believe everyone in the military should have basic medical training." "Your training was more than basic." The paramedics said, "You handled the situation like a professional." They were impressed. Sarah shrugged. "I just did what needed to be done." After the interview, Wilson and Chen escorted Sarah to the supply office. Chief Garcia looked up as they entered, his eyebrows rising at the sight of the armed guards. "Your life has gotten complicated," he observed. "You could say that." Chief Garcia handed her a stack of requisition forms. "Well, complicated or not, these still need processing. Think you can focus on work for a few hours?" Sarah welcomed the distraction of routine tasks. She buried herself in paperwork, letting the familiar rhythm of data entry and inventory management calm her racing thoughts. Wilson and Chen positioned themselves near the office entrance, alert but unobtrusive. Around mid-afternoon, Sarah's encrypted phone buzzed with an urgent message from her handlers. The 3 men who had assaulted her had been formally court-martialed and were being held pending trial. However, the judge advocate had uncovered evidence suggesting the assault might have been planned rather than spontaneous. They wanted Sarah to review some intercepted communications and see if she recognized any names or patterns. Sarah excused herself to use the restroom, Wilson and Chen following at a discreet distance. Once inside a secure location, she accessed the encrypted files on her phone. What she found made her blood run cold. The messages were from a group chat that included not just the 3 men who assaulted her, but also Lieutenant Commander Briggs and several other officers and senior enlisted personnel. The content of the messages was damning. They had been tracking Sarah since her arrival, noting her habits and routines. Someone had identified her as a potential whistleblower, though they didn't know the full extent of her mission. The assault wasn't random at all. It was meant to intimidate her into keeping quiet about what she observed. When that failed, they had moved to vandalism and threats. And the messages suggested they weren't done yet. Sarah forwarded the information to Special Agent Torres with a brief note. and composed a more detailed report for her handlers. This was bigger than she had initially thought. What she had uncovered wasn't just a culture problem or a few bad apples. It was an organized effort by senior personnel to protect a corrupt system and eliminate anyone who threatened to expose it. When Sarah returned to the supply office, she found Lieutenant Harris waiting for her with news. The preliminary hearing for your assault case has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. You'll need to testify. I'll be there, Sarah confirmed. Harris lowered her voice. There's something else you should know. I've been getting pressure to change my testimony, to say that maybe I didn't see things as clearly as I thought. People are suggesting that perhaps you provoked the attack somehow. Are you going to change your testimony? Sarah asked calmly. Harris straightened her shoulders. Absolutely not. I know what I saw, and I'm not going to lie to protect some criminals. But I wanted you to know that they're trying to undermine the case however they can. That evening, Sarah was escorted back to her quarters by Wilson and Chen. They did a thorough sweep of the room before allowing her inside, checking for any signs of tampering or hidden threats. Finding nothing, they positioned themselves outside her door and settled in for a long night of guard duty. Sarah used the evening to prepare for her testimony the next day. She reviewed her statement multiple times, ensuring every detail was accurate and consistent. She also continued documenting everything she observed, building a comprehensive case against the systemic problems at the facility. Around midnight, Sarah heard raised voices outside her door. She moved quietly to listen, her hand instinctively reaching for the improvised weapons she had prepared, a chair leg that could serve as a club, her metal water bottle, the combination lock from her gym bag. You can't be here, Wilson's voice said firmly. This area is restricted. Just want to talk to her, an unfamiliar male voice responded. Clear some things up before tomorrow's hearing. I don't care what you want. This area is off limits. You need to leave now, or I'm calling for backup and having you arrested for violating a protective order. Come on, man. We're all on the same team here. You really going to side with some troublemaker over your fellow sailors? I side with the law, Wilson replied. And the law says you need to leave. This is your last warning. Sarah heard footsteps retreating down the corridor, followed by Wilson speaking into his radio to report the incident. She made a note of the time and circumstances, adding it to her growing pile of evidence. The next morning arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle of rain. Sarah dressed in her service uniform, ensuring every detail was perfect. Today she would face her attackers in court, and she intended to make sure justice was served. The courtroom was located in the base's administration building, formal space with the seal of the United States Navy prominently displayed. Sarah entered with Wilson and Chen flanking her, their presence both protective and symbolic. The three defendants sat at the defense table with their attorneys, refusing to meet her eyes. Captain Monroe presided as the convening authority, her expression stern and impartial. The prosecution, led by a sharp young JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Susan Park, presented the evidence methodically. Photographs of Sarah's injuries, the security footage from the corridor outside the locker room, Lieutenant Harris's testimony, and finally, Sarah's own account of the assault. Sarah took the stand and swore to tell the truth. Commander Park guided her through her testimony, asking her to describe the events of that night in detail. Sarah spoke clearly and calmly, maintaining her composure even when the defense attorney tried to rattle her during cross-examination. Isn't it true, Petty Officer Mitchell, that you had been drinking that evening? The defense attorney asked. No, I had not consumed any alcohol. And isn't it true that you have a history of making false accusations against male service members? No, I have never made a false accusation against anyone. Isn't it convenient that Lieutenant Harris arrived just in time to witness this alleged assault? Almost as if you had arranged for her to be there? I didn't arrange anything. I was attacked, and Lieutenant Harris happened to intervene. I'm grateful she did. The defense attorney tried several more angles, attempting to paint Sarah as vindictive, unstable, or manipulative. But each attack failed against the wall of evidence and Sarah's unshakable testimony. When she finally stepped down from the stand, Sarah could see the frustration on the defense team's faces. Lieutenant Harris testified next, corroborating every detail of Sarah's account. Then came the medical examiner who had documented Sarah's injuries. followed by Special Agent Torres, who presented evidence of the subsequent intimidation campaign. The final piece of evidence was the intercepted communications that Sarah had reviewed the previous day. Commander Park presented them to the court, showing clearly that the assault had been premeditated and part of a larger pattern of harassment. The defendants' faces went pale as they realized the full extent of the case against them. Captain Monroe called a recess to review the evidence and prepare her ruling. Sarah waited in a private room with Wilson and Chen, trying not to think about how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had come to this base on a simple evaluation mission, and now she was at the center of a major criminal investigation. When court reconvened, Captain Monroe's expression was grave. After reviewing all the evidence presented, I find the defendants guilty of assault, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming. They will be remanded to the brig pending sentencing. Additionally, based on the evidence of a broader conspiracy, I am ordering a full investigation into the command structure and culture at this facility. Anyone found to have participated in the intimidation campaign or the cover-up will face appropriate charges. Sarah felt relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The captain had opened Pandora's box, and there was no telling what they would find inside. The investigation that Captain Monroe ordered moved swiftly and ruthlessly. Within 48 hours of the court-martial, Special Agent Torres and her team had expanded their scope to include interviews with over 100 personnel. The intercepted communications had provided a roadmap to the corruption, naming names and detailing incidents that had been buried for years. Sarah's assault had merely been the spark that ignited a powder keg that had been waiting to explode. Sarah continued her duties in the supply office. The atmosphere on the base had transformed completely. People who had once intimidated her now avoided eye contact. Those who had spread rumors about her suddenly found themselves under investigation. The protective detail of Wilson and Chen remained in place, though the threats had ceased entirely. Fear had replaced confidence. Among those who had operated outside the rules for so long, on the third day after the court-martial, Sarah received a message from her handlers requesting an immediate secure video call. She made arrangements to use a classified communications facility on base, a room that was regularly swept for electronic surveillance and maintained the highest security protocols. Wilson and Chen stood guard outside as Sarah entered and locked the door behind her, the video connection established. And Sarah found herself facing not just her immediate handlers, but 3 admirals, including the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. Her stomach tightened. This level of attention meant something significant was about to happen. Admiral Catherine Brennan, a woman Sarah had worked with on multiple classified operations, spoke first. "Commander Mitchell, thank you for joining us on short notice." Sarah blinked at the use of her actual rank. For weeks, she had been Petty Officer Mitchell, playing a role. Hearing her true identity acknowledged felt jarring. "Of course, ma'am. What's the situation?" "The situation is that your cover is about to be blown wide open," Admiral Brennan said bluntly. "Special Agent Torres is excellent at her job. She's been digging into your background, and she's found inconsistencies. She doesn't have all the pieces yet, but she will soon. We need to make a decision about how to proceed." Another admiral, a stern man with decades of combat experience named Admiral James Crawford, leaned forward. "The question is whether we pull you out now and classify the entire operation, or whether we allow the truth to come out and use it as leverage to clean house at that facility and others like it." Sarah considered this carefully. "What happens to the investigation if I'm pulled out?" "It continues," Admiral Brennan assured her. "The evidence against those 3 sailors and the conspiracy we've uncovered stands on its own. But your testimony and credibility become complicated if it's revealed you were operating undercover. Defense attorneys will argue you were a provocateur, that you manufactured the incident to justify your investigation. It's garbage, and any competent judge would see through it," Sarah replied. "I was assaulted. That's a fact. My identity doesn't change what happened to me." Admiral Crawford nodded. "We agree. But it will muddy the waters and potentially derail the broader investigation. On the other hand, if we reveal your true identity and rank now, it sends a powerful message. It shows that the Navy takes these issues seriously enough to send a decorated SEAL commander undercover to investigate them." Sarah understood the political calculation. but she wasn't comfortable with it. With respect, sirs, this isn't about sending messages. This is about fixing a broken system. If revealing my identity helps do that, fine. But I don't want to be used as a propaganda tool while the real problems get swept under the rug. Admiral Brennan smiled slightly. That's why you were chosen for this mission, Sarah. You care more about results than recognition. But the reality is that we need both. We need the systemic changes, and we need the visibility to prevent this from happening again at other facilities. What are you recommending? Sarah asked. We want to bring you in from the field but keep you at the facility as part of the investigation team, Admiral Crawford explained. Your cover will be officially revealed. You'll work openly with NCIS and the Inspector General's office to document everything you've observed. Your presence will also serve as protection for other witnesses who might be afraid to come forward. If a Navy SEAL commander is willing to stand up and testify, it empowers others to do the same. Sarah thought about the female sailors who had approached her quietly to share their own stories of harassment. She thought about Lieutenant Harris, who had risked her career to tell the truth. She thought about Petty Officer Chen, still recovering in the hospital from heat stroke caused by an abusive instructor. This wasn't about her ego or her reputation. It was about making sure those people got justice. I'll do it, Sarah said. But I have conditions. First, everyone who was part of that conspiracy faces appropriate charges regardless of rank. Second, we implement systemic reforms to prevent this from happening again. Third, any sailor who comes forward with testimony gets the same protection I received. And fourth, we do this right. No half measures, no political compromises that let the worst offenders slide. The three admirals exchanged glances. Finally, Admiral Brennan nodded, agreed. We'll start the process immediately. Captain Monroe will be briefed on your true identity this afternoon. By tomorrow morning, everyone on that base will know who you really are. The video call ended, and Sarah sat alone in the secure room for a few minutes, processing what was about to happen. For 20 years, she had operated in the shadows, her most significant accomplishments classified and unknown to all but a handful of people. Now she was about to step into the spotlight in the most public way imaginable. The thought was uncomfortable, but she had committed to it. Sarah emerged from the secure facility to find Wilson and Chen waiting patiently. Everything okay? Wilson asked. Everything's about to change, Sarah replied cryptically. But yes, everything's okay. That afternoon, Sarah was summoned to Captain Monroe's office again. This time, when she entered, she found not just the captain, but also Special Agent Torres, the base's executive officer, and a rear admiral from the Pacific Fleet. Captain Monroe gestured for Sarah to sit, her expression a mixture of shock and respect. Commander Mitchell, I understand we've been operating under false pretenses. I wish you had trusted me with your real identity from the beginning. With respect, Captain, that wasn't my decision to make, Sarah replied. My mission required operational security. I hope you understand. Monroe nodded slowly.
I do.
And having reviewed your actual service record, I'm impressed. 20 years as a SEAL, multiple combat deployments, classified operations I don't even have clearance to read about. You're probably the most qualified person on this entire base, and we had you processing supply requisitions. The supply work was excellent cover, Sarah said with a slight smile. And Chief Garcia is a good man. He didn't deserve to be deceived, but I hope he'll understand once he knows the full story. Special Agent Torres spoke up. I have to admit, I suspected something was off about your background. Nobody responds to an assault that calmly unless they have serious training. But I never imagined you were a SEAL commander. That explains a lot. The Rear Admiral leaned forward. Commander Mitchell, your mission here has uncovered serious problems that extend beyond this facility. We're implementing immediate reforms across the entire Pacific Fleet. New reporting procedures for harassment and assault. Mandatory training for all personnel, and an independent oversight board to investigate complaints. Your work has made a real difference. I appreciate that, sir. But the work isn't done. There are still people on this base who participated in that conspiracy. Some of them hold positions of authority. Until they're all held accountable, the culture won't really change. That's why you're going to help us finish this, Torres said. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working directly with my team. We're going to interview every sailor on this base if we have to. Anyone who witnessed harassment, anyone who was intimidated into silence, anyone who participated in the cover-up. We're going to find them all. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing strategy and logistics. Sarah would maintain quarters on the base, but would now have access to all classified facilities and resources. Her protective detail would be upgraded, though Sarah privately doubted she needed it. Most importantly, she would have the authority to question anyone, regardless of rank, and full support from the chain of command. That evening, Captain Monroe addressed the entire base via closed-circuit television. Sarah stood beside her as the captain explained the situation to thousands of shocked sailors. For the past 4 weeks, we have had a Navy SEAL commander operating undercover at this facility, Monroe announced. Commander Sarah Mitchell was sent here to evaluate our training protocols and operational standards. What she discovered instead was a culture of harassment, intimidation, and abuse. Many of you know her as Petty Officer Mitchell, the woman who was assaulted in the women's locker room and subsequently intimidated and threatened for speaking out. The camera panned to show Sarah in her dress uniform, her chest displaying 20 years of service ribbons, including the Navy Cross, multiple bronze stars, and Purple Hearts. The contrast between the quiet supply clerk and the decorated warrior was stark and deliberate. Commander Mitchell could have revealed her identity at any time, Monroe continued. She could have used her rank and authority to protect herself. Instead, she chose to endure that assault and the subsequent harassment because she wanted to understand exactly what regular sailors face on this base. She wanted to see how we handle reports of misconduct, whether our systems protect victims or punish them. And what she found was unacceptable. Monroe's voice hardened. Effective immediately, we are conducting a comprehensive review of all personnel assigned to this facility. Anyone found to have participated in harassment, assault, intimidation, or cover-ups will face appropriate charges. This includes officers, senior enlisted, and anyone else who thought their rank protected them from accountability. It doesn't, the captain paused, letting that sink in. I know many of you are good sailors who were afraid to speak up because you feared retaliation. That ends now. Commander Mitchell's presence here, working alongside NCIS and the Inspector General's office, is your guarantee that you will be heard and protected. If you have information about misconduct, we want to hear from you. If you have been a victim, we want to support you. This is your chance to help us fix what's broken. After the broadcast ended, Sarah returned to her quarters, now a larger room befitting her actual rank. She found a stack of messages waiting for her, mostly from sailors requesting to speak with her. Some were victims sharing their stories. Others were witnesses who had been too afraid to come forward. A few were even perpetrators wanting to confess and seek leniency. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah worked 8-hour days interviewing personnel, reviewing evidence, and building cases. The scope of the corruption was staggering. She documented over 40 separate incidents of harassment or assault that had been covered up. She identified 17 officers and senior enlisted personnel who had actively participated in intimidation campaigns against victims. She uncovered a systematic pattern of falsifying training records, cutting safety corners, and prioritizing unit reputation over sailor well-being. Lieutenant Commander Briggs was arrested and charged with negligent homicide after Petty Officer Chen died from complications related to his heat stroke. The instructor who had pushed a teenager to death in the name of toughness finally faced justice. Sarah attended Chen's memorial service and personally promised his grieving parents that his death would mean something. It would lead to changes that would protect other young sailors. The 3 men who had assaulted Sarah were sentenced to 10 years in military prison, dishonorable discharges, and forfeiture of all benefits. Their sentences were meant to send a clear message that assaulting a fellow service member would not be tolerated. Several others who had participated in the intimidation campaign received lesser sentences, but all of them were removed from the military. Chief Garcia, upon learning Sarah's true identity, had been embarrassed and apologetic. Sarah assured him he had nothing to apologize for. He had treated her with respect and given her work that kept her cover intact. She recommended him for a commendation for his professionalism and integrity. Lieutenant Harris was promoted and transferred to a position where she could continue her career without the toxic environment that had plagued the training facility. She and Sarah maintained contact, forming a friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Captain Monroe was recognized by the Chief of Naval Operations for her handling of the crisis. She had taken a difficult situation and turned it into an opportunity for real reform. The training facility became a model for how to address systemic problems rather than hide them. 6 months after Sarah's cover was blown, she stood before a congressional committee investigating military culture and sexual assault. She testified publicly about her experience, describing both the assault she had endured and the broader patterns of misconduct she had uncovered. Her testimony was powerful and unvarnished, pulling no punches about the institutional failures that had allowed such behavior to persist. "The problem isn't that bad people join the military," Sarah told the committee. "The problem is that we create systems that protect bad behavior and punish those who speak out against it. We tell sailors to follow the chain of command, but what happens when the chain of command is part of the problem? We tell them to be tough and resilient, but we use that as an excuse to ignore legitimate complaints. We prioritize unit cohesion over individual justice, and that creates an environment where abusers thrive." A senator asked Sarah what she would recommend to fix these issues. Her answer was direct and comprehensive. First, we need independent oversight. Complaints about harassment and assault should be investigated by people outside the immediate chain of command. Second, we need to protect whistleblowers aggressively. Anyone who faces retaliation for reporting misconduct should see swift and severe consequences for those who retaliated. Third, we need to change the culture from the top down. Officers need to be evaluated not just on their operational performance, but on how they treat their people and whether they maintain ethical standards. The congressional testimony led to new legislation mandating reforms across all branches of the military. Sarah's experience became a case study taught at officer training schools, an example of both the problems that existed and the courage required to confront them. Throughout all of this, Sarah remained focused on her core mission. It wasn't about recognition or awards or being held up as a hero. It was about making sure that the next generation of sailors would serve in an environment where they were safe, respected, and empowered to speak truth to power without fear. A year after her cover was blown, Sarah returned to the training facility for a ceremony. The base was dedicating a new building, a comprehensive support center for sailors dealing with harassment, assault, or other misconduct. It included counseling services, legal assistance, medical care, and advocacy resources, all in one location. The center was named after Petty Officer David Chen, the young sailor who had died during training. Sarah spoke at the dedication ceremony, addressing an audience that included Chun's parents, survivors of harassment who had found their voices, and the new generation of sailors training at the reformed facility. "What happened here was wrong," Sarah said simply. "Good people were hurt, and some didn't survive. But their suffering wasn't meaningless. Every person who came forward, every witness who told the truth, every victim who refused to be silenced, they all contributed to changing this institution for the better. The culture we have now isn't perfect, but it's better than what came before, and it will continue to improve as long as we remain committed to holding ourselves to the highest standards." She looked out at the young faces in the audience, sailors at the beginning of their careers. "Some of you will face challenges during your service. You'll encounter people who abuse their authority, who mistake cruelty for strength, who think rank gives them the right to mistreat others. When that happens, I want you to remember this place and what happened here. I want you to remember that speaking up is not weakness, it's courage. Standing up for what's right, even when it costs you something, that's what honor means." After the ceremony, a young female sailor approached Sarah nervously. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, fresh out of basic training. "Commander Mitchell, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," Sarah said warmly. The young sailor glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then spoke quietly. "I just wanted to say thank you. I almost didn't join the Navy because I heard stories about how women get treated. But then I read about what you did here, how you stood up even when people tried to hurt you. It made me think that maybe things could be different. That maybe I could help make them different. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. This was why she had endured everything, why she had let herself be assaulted and intimidated and threatened, so that young sailors, like this woman, could serve without fear. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Seaman Recruit Jennifer Martinez, ma'am." "Well, Jennifer, I'm glad you decided to serve. The Navy needs people like you, people who believe in doing the right thing. And I promise you, if you ever face a situation where someone tries to intimidate you or hurt you, you will be heard. You will be protected. And the people who hurt you will face consequences. That's my commitment to you and everyone else who wears this uniform." Martinez smiled, her eyes bright with determination. "I'm going to hold you to that, ma'am." "Please do," Sarah replied. As Sarah walked away from the ceremony, she reflected on her 2 decades of service. She had conducted operations in hostile territories, led teams through impossible situations, and earned commendations that would remain classified for years to come. But this mission, this fight to change the culture and protect vulnerable sailors, felt like the most important work she had ever done. Her phone buzzed with a message from Admiral Brennan. "Next assignment ready when you are. This one involves actual enemies instead of internal ones. Interested?" Sarah smiled and typed back. "Always ready, ma'am. But I want to maintain oversight on these reforms. Make sure they stick. Already arranged. You'll consult on implementation while running your ops. Nobody else could balance both." Sarah looked back at the training facility one last time. Young sailors were drilling on the parade ground, their movements synchronized and precise. Instructors watched carefully, pushing their recruits to excel while respecting their humanity. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And it would continue to improve because people cared enough to make it happen. She had come to this base as an undercover investigator, expecting to find minor issues with training protocols. Instead, she had uncovered systemic corruption and become the center of a firestorm that had transformed military culture. She had been assaulted, threatened, tested in ways that had nothing to do with physical courage and everything to do with moral conviction. But she had also found hope. She had met sailors like Lieutenant Harris who stood up for what was right despite the personal cost. She had seen Captain Monroe take difficult action to clean up her command rather than protect it. She had witnessed hundreds of victims find their voices and demand justice. And she had met young sailors like Jennifer Martinez, who believed the Navy could be better and were willing to work to make it happen. As Sarah drove away from the base, toward her next assignment, she carried with her the knowledge that her work had mattered. Not the classified operations that had earned her medals nobody would ever see. Not the enemies she had defeated in foreign lands. But this simple act of standing up to bullies and refusing to be silenced, this fight for justice in her own ranks, for the safety and dignity of the sailors who served beside her, that, Sarah thought, was what honor really meant. Not fearlessness in the face of the enemy, but courage in the face of corruption. Not the ability to fight, but the willingness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Not just following orders, but questioning them when they were wrong. Sarah Mitchell had been a Navy SEAL for 20 years. She had faced enemy combatants, natural disasters, and impossible odds. But the fight she was proudest of was the one she had waged in a simple locker room on a training base in San Diego. The fight to make sure that every sailor, regardless of gender or rank, could serve with dignity and without fear. That was a mission worth completing, no matter the cost.